My name's Sarah, and this happened 2 years ago when I was commuting home from work late one night. I worked the closing shift at a small cafe in the city, and by the time I locked up and made it to the train station, it was almost midnight. The platform was nearly deserted, just me, a flickering overhead light, and the hum of the approaching train echoing through the tunnel. I remember feeling the cold of the concrete bench against my legs and the faint metallic scent in the air. The train arrived with the screech of brakes, and as the doors slid open, I stepped into the car and sat near the middle. It was empty except for one man sitting at the far end. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low, obscuring most of his face. I didn't think much of it. People keep to themselves late at night, but something about the way he was sitting, perfectly still, made me uneasy. I plugged in my earbuds and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. The train lurched forward, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows on the man's face as we passed through dimly lit tunnels. I glanced at my reflection in the window, and that's when I realized something. The man wasn't just sitting there, he was staring right at me. His hood was down just enough for me to see his eyes, unblinking, focused, locked onto mine. I turned my gaze back to my phone, pretending I didn't notice. My heart raced with every passing second. Each time I dared to look, he hadn't shifted an inch. His eyes never left me. At the next station, the doors opened with a hiss, but no one got on. For a split second, I considered bolting out of the train, but it was late, and I'd still have to walk several blocks alone if I got off early. I convinced myself I was overreacting. 2 stops later, I stood up as casually as I could, gripping my bag tightly, and moved to sit closer to the door. The man's head turned, following my movement. The next 5 minutes stretched into an eternity. My stop was coming up, and I formed a plan. As soon as the train stopped, I'd sprint to the stairs and get out of there. The train slowed, and I braced myself. The doors opened, and I bolted out of there. I heard heavy footsteps behind me, too heavy and too fast to be a coincidence. I reached the stairs and took them 2 at a time. My legs burned, but I didn't dare to stop. The footsteps grew louder. I hit the top of the stairs and spotted a ticket booth with a single attendant inside. I sprinted toward it, waving frantically. "Help! Someone's following me!" I shouted. The attendant, an older man, immediately stepped out. The footsteps behind me slowed, then stopped. I turned around. The man in the hoodie was standing at the base of the stairs, his face finally visible under the station's lights. His eyes were sharp, his lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Hey!" the attendant yelled, stepping forward. The man didn't move. He just stared at me for a few more seconds, then turned around and walked back down the stairs. The police were called, and when they checked the security cameras, they found footage of the man trailing me for several blocks before I even got to the train station. He'd stood behind a pillar on the platform, waiting until I boarded before following me into the train car. But here's the part that I'll never forget. He never boarded at my stop. The camera showed him getting on the train at a different station, the one right by the cafe where I worked. The police never caught him. I quit my job the next day and moved to a different part of the city. I haven't taken the train since. But sometimes when I'm walking alone, I still get that feeling, that cold, prickling sensation of being watched, and I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting, watching, just a few steps behind. My name's Daniel, and this happened to me about a year ago. I was heading home after a long shift at the hospital where I worked. It was around 1 a.m., and I was dead on my feet. I took the last train out of the city, a nearly empty carriage except for a businessman nodding off near the doors and a young woman scrolling through her phone. I sat down by the window, watching the dimly lit tunnels blur past. That's when I noticed him, a man sitting diagonally across from me. I did a double take. It was Ryan Cole. We'd gone to high school together more than 10 years ago. Ryan had been one of those people who always had a wild story to tell you and a grin that made you feel like you were on some big joke. But here, on this train, he looked different. Pale, hollow-cheeked. His clothes were loose and faded, like they hadn't been washed in weeks. "Ryan? Is that you?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine. That familiar grin stretched across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Danny," he said softly. His voice was raspy, like he'd been breathing in smoke. "Been a while." I forced a smile. "Yeah, what? 10 years now?" 11. He corrected. Then he tilted his head. "Did you ever go to that party?" That question stopped me cold. Senior year in high school, Ryan had begged me to go to this party, but I said no because I had an exam the next day. He joked I was boring, that I'd miss out on something unforgettable. I remembered laughing it off at the time. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "Nah, I didn't go." Ryan's smile widened now. "Shame. That was one hell of a night," he whispered. The train lurched, and the lights flickered overhead. My pulse quickened. Something felt off, beyond the weird conversation. His skin looked wrong, grayish. His eyes, though, open and locked onto mine, didn't blink for once. The carriage lights buzzed and dimmed for a few seconds, and in that shadowed moment, I swear the air around us turned ice cold. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. "So what are you up to these days?" I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Ryan's head twitched slightly to the side. His eyes didn't leave me. "Still at the party. You should have come, Danny. You really missed out." The train slowed down as we approached the next station. I stood up abruptly, gripping the metal pole. "Well, I get off here. Good seeing you, ma'am." Ryan's smile disappeared. "This isn't your stop," he said, voice flat now. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors hissed open. I bolted out, not caring if it was the wrong stop. As I reached the platform, I glanced back into the car. Ryan was still sitting there, motionless, unblinking. But now he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 3 other people, pale and hollow-eyed, all staring at me with those same stretched grins. I didn't see them bored when I got on. The door slid shut, and the train pulled away. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and typed in his name. I needed to know what happened to him. A few minutes later, after scrolling online, I found it. An old news article from 11 years ago. The headline read, "4 teens presumed dead after a quarry party collapses into an abandoned mine shaft." One of the names stood out to me immediately. Ryan hole. His body had never been recovered. The train I just left was an express. It didn't stop at that station. Hadn't in years. I don't take the night shifts anymore. And sometimes when I pass that empty platform, I catch a glimpse of movement through the dark windows of the passing trains. A pale face and a twisted grin. And I know, even after all this time, Ryan's still at that party, waiting for someone like me to finally show up. My name's Megan, and this happened 6 months ago when I was taking the late-night train home after visiting a friend across town. I remember the night vividly. Cold, damp air hanging in the city like a wet blanket, and the train car smelling faintly of metal and stale rain. It was nearly midnight, and aside from a man dozing near the back and a woman buried in a book a few seats over, the car was empty. The train rattled along the tracks, swaying with each turn. I was scrolling through my phone when, without warning, the lights overhead flickered. The train gave a violent jolt and screeched to a halt. The sudden stillness made the air feel heavier somehow. An automated announcement crackled through the speakers. Attention passengers, we are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain seated. I glanced out the window. We were stuck in a tunnel, thick concrete walls pressing in on both sides. The dim emergency lights bathed everything in a sickly, reddish glow. My phone had no signal. I told myself it was just a mechanical issue, nothing to worry about. A few minutes passed. The woman with the book shifted uncomfortably, but kept reading. The man in the back snored softly. And then came another announcement. Except this time, the voice sounded off. Passengers, do not leave the train. Do not engage with anyone outside the car. Engage? I sat up straighter now. That wasn't normal. I turned to look toward the doors, and outside, just beyond the glass, a figure stood in the tunnel. The dim red lights made it hard to see details, but I could tell it was a man. He wore dark clothes and stood perfectly still, facing our car. The woman across from me noticed, too. She met my gaze, eyes wide. Neither of us said a word. We just stared at the figure. Something about him didn't feel right. The speakers crackled again, the voice more distorted now. Do not engage. Do not trust the man outside the train. My breath was caught in my throat. The figure moved closer. I could see more of him now. His clothes were ragged, his face pale and expressionless. He stepped right up to the window, tilted his head, studied us like animals in a cage. And then he smiled. The train car door suddenly groaned as if something was forcing it open. The woman with the book scrambled to her feet and backed away. I stood too, heart pounding. The man's smile never faltered as he wedged his fingers into the gap between the doors and started pulling. The metal creaked open and bent under his grip. The lights flickered violently now. The man's eyes were locked onto us as the doors slid open with a metallic screech. He stepped into the car. His footsteps were unnaturally soft against the floor. The woman bolted to the back, shaking the next set of doors, trying to get through to the next car. They wouldn't budge. The The sleeping man woke up now, confused, just as the pale man lunged toward him. The stranger moved with unnatural speed. He grabbed the man's arm and dragged him to the door. The man screamed, but it was cut off as his body was yanked into the tunnel. The stranger turned back to us, smiling now, plastered all over his face. I sprinted to the emergency exit at the other end of the car. The woman was ahead of me, pounding on the release latch. Behind us, footsteps approached. The stranger was toying with us. The latch finally gave out, and the door opened. The woman squeezed through first, disappearing into the darkness. I followed, dropping into the tunnel. The cold concrete was slick beneath my shoes. I heard the footsteps again, this time on the gravel behind me. I turned my head just enough to see him stepping out of the train, his eyes still locked onto mine. We ran. The tunnel seemed endless. My legs burned, but adrenaline kept me going. Behind me, the footsteps quickened. I could hear his breathing now, slow, steady, too calm for someone running at that pace. I looked up ahead and saw that there was a maintenance ladder bolted to the tunnel wall. The woman reached it first, scrambling upward. I followed, climbing as fast as I could. Below us, the stranger reached the base of the ladder. He didn't climb, he just stared up, that grin stretching wider than before. And then he spoke out. His voice was low, too familiar. It was the same distorted tone from the train speakers. "You shouldn't have left the train." The woman screamed. I climbed faster. We reached the top, kicked open a rusted hatch, and collapsed onto the wet pavement of an empty street. Behind us, the ladder remained still, but the man didn't follow. The police didn't find anyone in the tunnel. The conductor swore the train had never made an unscheduled stop. Security footage? Corrupted. But the missing passenger, the man who'd been dragged out by the man, was real. His wallet was found lying on the tracks, torn and slick with something dark. Now, whenever I take the train, I pay attention during delays, because sometimes if you look closely into the darkness, you'll see him standing there, watching, waiting for the next person to step off the train.